So, welcome to our discussion on anti-Semitism. I think what I will do is actually just start the presentation and double check that you can see it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the discussion is about anti-Semitism. I'm going to set up the PowerPoint to be up in presentation mode, and the reason. Well, let me just kind of set a couple of ground rules to begin with. Um, I when I conduct classes, as those of you who are sort of my regulars know, I love to go off topic and invite questions and go on different streams. Tonight, I am going to try not to do that. I'm going to try and stick to the presentation. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation. I will be presenting material, and every now and again, I will pause and ask if there's questions or comments. And I think at that point in time, depending on how things go, you can unmute yourself. Well, I strongly recommend you raise your electronic hands. If you don't know how to do that, I'm sorry. It'll be hard for me to see you because we already have like over 60 people, and I can only see 50 at a time. But you can also type questions in chat. So my plan generally is to every now and again pause the presentation and ask if there are questions or discussions. But I'm going to try and keep that under control, so we do have time to cover all the material. So the subject is anti-Semitism, why the Jews, a look at history and causes. And I always like to acknowledge my sponsor. The reason that I don't have to charge for these presentations is because I'm supported by the Jewish Federation of Ventura County and the Joel and Barbara Aronson Affordable Living Choices Trust. So let me begin by covering what I want to do and what this talk or class is and what the class is not. My intent is to focus on history and texts. And I really, when I came up with this idea, my goal was to help non-Jews understand Jewish anxiety about anti-Semitism and the way your Jewish friends are reacting to the news in Israel. I, of course, have opened it up, and I suspect many people here are not Jewish, and I hope also many people here are Jewish. Many people here are not Jewish. It is not meant to be a discussion of Zionism. It is not meant to be a discussion of competing claims to the Holy Land, the land of Israel. It is not intended to be political, and it's not intended to address, in any kind of detail, the recent events occurring in Gaza. If that's your goal, God bless you. This is not the time to do that. There's plenty of time to do that. And by the way, there are plenty of people who are far more knowledgeable than I am to cover these kinds of things. So let me jump in, and this is a little wordy, but there's always a discussion and question about what is anti-Semitism. So there's a group called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that defines it as in the following ways. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals, their property, toward the community institutions, and religious facilities. And notice the spelling of anti-Semitism, which is more and more adopted. If you look at older text, you'll find anti-Semitism spelled as anti-Semitism, as though there is a concept called Semitism, which anti-Semitism opposes. That's not it. Anti-Semitism is Jew hatred. And this same organization, and there's a link there, gives some examples, a lot of examples, of contemporary illustrations of anti-Semitism. So some of them are very obvious. Calling for, aiding, justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. making mendacious, lying, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews, such as the power of Jews as a collective, a myth of world Jewish conspiracy, Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions, accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jew, person, or group, or even acts committed by non-Jews. Denying the fact, scope, mechanisms, such as gas chambers, relating to the Holocaust at the hand of the Nazis. Accusing the Jews as a people, or Israel as a state, of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel. Well, now I'm getting an echo. That's fixed. Okay, good. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priority of Jews worldwide than the interest of their own nation. Denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor. Applying double standards by requiring of it, namely Israel, a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism. And I'll be discussing some of these issues relating to the killing of Jesus or blood libel to characterize Israel or Israelis, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of Nazis, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. So recent anti-Semitism, and this is mainly just images. One is, if you look for images about anti-Semitic incidents, you will find lots of them. Suffice it to say that it's increasing dramatically in the last year. This actually only goes up to 2021, but also in the last month since October 7th. By most measures, there have been 3 to 4 times the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States in the last month as compared with the same time period a year ago. And we've seen this, actually, this is an earlier one. This was in Los Angeles, people giving Nazi salutes saying Kanye is right about the Jews. There's a website, Goyim, actually, I don't know the rest of the website, and a reference to 2 passages in the New Testament that some of you New Testament scholars may recognize, and I will quote one of those later about Jews being the Satan or being the child of Satan. So that's recent. We'll all remember this image from I guess Charlottesburg, of people chanting "Jews will not replace us," and with a Nazi flag. And the point I want to make about an image like this is here was a demonstration, in theory, directed toward opposing removing Confederate statues. Okay, if you go back, what was this all about when it occurred? That, in theory, was the goal. And what we see, and what is very troubling to Jews, very troubling in terms of anti-Semitism, is you're opposed to removing Confederate military statues, so you march with swastikas and chant "Jews will not replace us." Well, what does swastikas and Jews have to do with Confederate symbols? Of course, the murders in Pittsburgh. This was just something I found. This is in Sydney, Australia, the day after October 7th. So this is the day after 1,400 Jews were murdered, kidnapped, and so on, a chant of "Gas the Jews." And this will be familiar to those of us living in the Thousand Oaks, Southern California area, where a man was killed at the hands of someone. There were pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian demonstrators, and one of the pro-Israel demonstrators was killed at the hands of a pro-Palestine demonstrator. This is also a very maybe subtle, but an image that I want you to be aware of. Keep the world clean. Well, who could be against keeping the world clean? But look what's in the garbage can. Look what the goal of cleansing is. And this is in Poland, and I think this is in New York. So this is another image. The other one you hear from time to time is, from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, which sounds great. We're all in favor of freedom. But what they're really saying is the state of Israel should disappear. And for the state of Israel to disappear, 7 million Jews would have to die because the Israelis are not going to leave. Another very powerful image again. So here we're in the midst, this was the Capitol riot in 2021. We're in the midst of people who are protesting and demonstrating against the 2020 election, arguing that the election was fixed. So what does that have to do with Camp Auschwitz? It's stunning. This actually, I think, is an interesting one. This is in June of this year, so it doesn't relate to the events of recent, of the recent month, but of the anti-Semitic incidents in June of this year, we have the far left, the far right, and Islamicist. It always, I find it just stunning, the idea that Jew hatred can bring Nazis and leftists together on something they can agree upon. They can't agree on absolutely anything, the far left and the far right, but apparently they can agree on about Jew hatred. In terms of historical context, and again, I came to teaching this, and some of you, with some of you, I've had extensive conversations on this. The idea that Jew hatred is the world's oldest hatred, and it's very frightening for us Jews because it is seemingly rising from the ashes. Every nation, I'll actually go through a list of them, with the important exception of the Americas that have had a significant Jewish population, has at one time or another expelled its Jews. Typically, Jews were given the choice: convert to another religion, leave the country, or be murdered. As we'll see, it's more than 2,000 years old. And, it often strikes me that my grandmother and my wife experienced the same thing. I know you don't know my grandmother. She left Russia in the early 1900s, maybe the late 1800s, at age 16, coming actually with her brother to live in New York because of Russian pogroms and fear of Russian anti-Semitism. And my wife Sonia left Morocco in 1967, also about the same age, 15 or 16, coming to New York with her brother, neither of them speaking a word of English, because of fear and the danger of a young Jewish woman living in an Arab country in the immediate aftermath of the Six-Day War in Israel. So here's a list. I'm not going to go through them. You can look at the nations listed. The very famous one, certainly in Jewish culture, is Spain in 1492, which is when my wife's family left Spain and went to Morocco. But expulsions and restrictions all throughout, I'd say more modern history. And in terms of the Arab world, from 1948 to 1967, when there was a place for Jews to go easily, namely Israel, virtually all the Jews living in Arab lands left their homeland to come to Israel. What I would say is it's almost a strategic decision, and this might be hard to understand in terms of the grand scope of history. So you kind of know the biblical story of the Jews, right? So we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's children, Joseph, goes down to Egypt. In Egypt, 400 years, we have the Exodus, and we go into the Holy Land. And then we actually, with the conquering of the Holy Land, approximately in the year 1200, 1100, before the Common Era. You have a Jewish state created in the Holy Land, actually 12 separate tribes, which, roughly 100 years later becomes one Jewish nation, with Saul as the first king, and then David and Solomon as kings of Israel. And then they split into two nations, Judah and Israel. They are subject to Greek influence, and the Greeks, we have the Hanukkah story with Greek oppression of the Jews revolt against the Greeks, get back control of the country, and then they make a huge mistake of inviting the Romans in to settle some issues, and the Romans are very happy to take over. The temple, which is the center of Judaism, is destroyed twice, 586 BCE and 70 of the Common Era. And then the Jews make a very important deal, if you will, with the Romans and with the entire world. And I always like to slide way back here in the corner of my room to illustrate this deal. The Jews say to the world the following: we're going to hide over here. Well, not exactly hide. We are going to hang out over here. We have our own little nation. We don't have a land. You Romans control the land, and then Christians take over and Muslims take over, and and lots of folks take over the land of Israel. But we're going to stay in the land of Israel, and we're also going to be Jews around the world. We have our own language. We have our own laws. We are not going to raise an army. We are not going to have a king. You don't have to worry about us because we have our own language and our own laws. We are perfect for being merchants because we can work with Jews around the world. A Jew from Morocco can do business with a Jew from Russia, even though, because we have a common language, Hebrew, and a common law, Jewish law. The deal is we will govern ourselves. We will be a separate nation. Don't bother us. And that deal stays in place for roughly 2,000 years, 1,900 years, 1,800 years, subject from time to time to absolutely horrible and nightmarish persecution. And what happens about 150 years ago or so is Jews decide that this is no longer acceptable. It's no longer acceptable to be defenseless, to place our living and well-being at the hands of other nations. So a new concept called Zionism is created. And Zionism, the word Zion means really Jerusalem, with the idea that we want to go back to the land that we have been in constantly all this time for about 3,000 years. And we actually want to establish a state there and be a nation like any other nation and have an army. So, in the 30s and 40s, you have Jews basically taking up weapons to protect Jewish settlements, kibbutzim, and so on. And of course, we have the state of Israel in 1948. I'm going to pause for a moment to see if there are questions. I'll take a quick look at the chat. No, I don't see anything in the chat. Does anyone have a question or more clarification rather than, arguing a point of view one way or the other? If not, I'll go on with the reasons for anti-Semitism. But that sort of covers, Alan, yeah, go ahead.
So you're describing the history is starting, I guess, before the Roman period, if I understand that. I just wanted to see if there's something you can describe as when Jew hatred started. Would it happen when?
Certainly Egypt.
Egypt.
Pharaoh is concerned about the Jews living in the land of Egypt. They're good citizens. Joseph is prime minister. I'll talk a little more about the history. Then there's the Persian period, which is also probably 300-400 BCE, where at the whim of a prime minister, he asks the king to put all the Jews to death in Persia, modern day Iran, and the king says, of course, no big deal.
So is this really the story of the history of the other? right? So in Persia or in Egypt, um,
Yeah, but there were lots of other nations. So most of those nations have disappeared.
oh, good
So I,
point.
I don't know if
Thank
they
you.
have left records.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the reason for anti-Semitism, if this were a smaller group, um, I might ask you to suggest reasons, and lots of people will suggest reasons. And as you'll see, one of the books that's heavily influenced me, and I'll show you the book in a moment, the reason for anti-Semitism is Judaism. The reason is Jewish teachings and Jewish ideas. It's not because we're smarter or more powerful or good looking, although I won't go there. It's none of those reasons. It's the teachings of Judaism. And as I stress in a class on my website about Jewish literacy, Judaism rests on three legs: God, Torah, and Israel. So Judaism invents this concept of God, or gets into relationship with a invisible God whose primary issue is ethics. And that's a problem for the rest of the world. From a Christian point of view, and we'll talk a lot more about this, Christians could not forgive the Jews for the rejection of Jesus. And, going so far as I would say to fabricate the idea that it was the Jews who were responsible for the death of Jesus. Jews were people reading the Bible in Hebrew, understanding the Bible, which is Hebrew Bible is what Christians call the Old Testament. And when Christians read the Old Testament, they come up with the conclusion that everything's pointing toward Jesus. Jews don't go there. So Jewish existence is a thorn at the least in the side of Christian theology. In a similar way, Muslims could not forgive the Jews' rejection of Muhammad's revelation and the material that's found in the Quran. Quite simply, everything that was in the Quran was either also in the Hebrew Bible, therefore not new, or confused about the Hebrew Bible, and therefore, from a Jewish perspective, not true. By and large, on the left wing, and I think this is true today, the Nazis and the communists could not tolerate, no, not so much the left wing, God-based ethics and values. I mean, many people have observed that anyone who would want to be ruler of the earth has to get rid of the Jews, because we proclaim that God is the ruler and not the czar and not the Führer. And as we'll see, there's also we're going to see another element of this in a moment. So the second leg of this three-legged stool is Torah and Jewish law. Torah is revelation in a broad sense. Jewish law is what governs Judaism. The major difference between Judaism and many other religions is Judaism's focus is not so much on what you believe, but what you do. And on questions of belief, Judaism tends to be very flexible. On questions of what you're supposed to do, Judaism, I sometimes describe it as OCD, as just super controlling. But the result of these laws has an effect on culture. So for one thing, dietary laws, keeping kosher, and the Sabbath keep Jews separate. And you can argue, and I would agree with you, even to keep Jews from intermarrying. There's a tremendous emphasis on education, study, and learning, which result in Jewish success. Jews have 100 times our expected number of Nobel Prizes. Jews constitute 2/10 of the world's population, 2/10 of 1%, sorry, 2/10 of 1% of the world's population, and about 20% of the Nobel Prizes of the world, and a higher percentage if you focus on science and mathematics. And these laws have health implications as well. Washing hands, washing foods, and so on. And importantly, Jews are obligated to teach these values to society and not remain apart and distant. As I sometimes say, in Jewish thought, you do not have the right to remain silent. As our mission in Judaism is to proclaim to the world the God of Abraham. It's not to convert. This actually is probably worth saying. I don't have this in one of my slides. You will never have someone come knocking on your door with the good news about Moses. The focus of Jews and Judaism is, I won't say has never been, but in the last roughly over 2,000 years, has not been to convert anyone. In fact, theoretically, a rabbi who is working with someone for conversion is expected to discourage the person from converting 3 times. So Judaism does not teach you need to be Jewish to get the benefits of the world to come, whatever that is, the heavens, because Judaism focuses on this world, not on the next world. And anyone who is righteous gets those benefits. And then one which is, significant in the context of discussing Zionism and current events is Israel. And Israel has several meanings. Jews understand ourselves as Am Yisrael, which means the people of Israel. And it has always been that way. So there's 3 meanings to Israel in Judaism. The people Israel, Am Yisrael, the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, and since 1948, the state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael. Judaism is the last surviving example of a time when your nationality and your religion were one and the same. In ancient times, if you were living in ancient Egypt, you'd worship Egyptian gods. If you were living in ancient Greece, you'd worship Greek gods. If someone were to ask an Egyptian, what's your religion? It would be a meaningless question. Your religion and your nationality were one and the same. Judaism is the last surviving example of that. We understand ourselves not only as a religion, but as a people. And therefore, if someone is born to Jewish parents, they are Jewish, whether they share Jewish beliefs or whether they even know it. Great example of that was Madeleine Albright, whose parents were Jewish and converted to Christianity to escape anti-Semitism. And she was raised without ever knowing that her parents were Jewish in wartime Czechoslovakia, and discovered only after she became Secretary of State that her parents were Jewish. And you can't get out, by the way, if it's your nationality. So therefore, she is as Jewish as the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. The anti-Semitism of the left, communism, socialism, and even modern left, is often aimed at the state of Israel and Zionism. And we'll see, quotes from Voltaire and others who might be perfectly comfortable with Judaism if it were understood as simply a religion, but there's a lot of discomfort with Judaism understanding itself as both a religion and a nationality. And then this is a theme which I'll repeat again. It is perfectly kosher. It is perfectly okay to disagree with the politics of Israel. Before October 7th, every weekend, there were enormous protests in Israel. And I know Alan Warshaw, who's here with us tonight, and an old friend of mine, has been visited Israel recently, was present in some of those protests. There's enormous criticism of the Israeli government by Israelis and by Jews around the world and by non-Jews around the world. That's politics. That's okay. It is not okay to object to the existence of Israel as a state and as a homeland for Jews. It's kind of like saying, I love French people and French culture and French food, but there should not be a nation called France. So again, referring to something I touched upon, in the ancient world, you have Egypt and the story of the Exodus, the biblical story of Esther, the Hellenistic anti-Semitism, Greek anti-Semitism, the Hanukkah revolt, and then in Rome, there was attempts to revolts to shed Roman rule, unsuccessful revolts in 66 CE and 135 CE. By the way, Jews don't say BC, before Christ. We would say before the Common Era. And we don't say AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord, but CE, Common Era. As I mentioned earlier also, Christian anti-Semitism arises from actually a pretty simple point. Jesus and his disciples were Jews whose message was directed at other Jews. And originally Christianity was a Jewish movement, just as we have several different Jewish movements today. In the first century, you could literally be a Jew for Jesus, because the Christian movement was a form of Judaism, and they were called Notzrim, the people from Nazareth, or following the guy from Nazareth. But as that continued, Christianity became a non-Jewish movement, a Gentile movement, and the Jewish rejection of Christianity becomes a theological challenge. A book that heavily influenced me, and some of you know I wrote a book for Christians about Judaism and greatly influenced my own chapter on anti-Semitism, is a book called Why the Jews? The Reason for Anti-Semitism, the Most Accurate Predictor of Human Evil, by Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin. And in the last few weeks, I came across this book called A Brief History of Anti-Semitism. It's not brief. It's a big book, and it's actually one really geared at classroom use. So I want to begin. I'll pause for a second and ask if there's any questions about kind of the historical overview. I'll take a drink of water.
Hold on, I want to ask you a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, what is the difference between viewing Jews as Jewishness as a religion, as a nation, and as a culture?
Okay, so let me eliminate culture, because my wife's family is from Morocco, and her culture is very different than my culture. There are Jews from Ethiopia whose culture is completely different than the culture of Jews from other lands. So I would not describe Jews as a culture at all, but Jews are both a nation and a religion. They are a nation in that you are born into it.
Let you add the days to new point.
Sorry, can we mute that? They're a nation in that you're born into being Jewish, irrespective of your beliefs. And if you're born Jewish, you are fully Jewish. Even if you convert to another religion, you're still under Jewish law considered Jewish. So you would say, well, Jews are a nation, but Jews are also a religion in that anyone can convert to Judaism, and you convert to Judaism by accepting Jewish ideas, faith, and teaching. So Judaism, the technical term is sui generis. It's unique in that it is both. Alan.
When you made a reference to early Christians and anti-Semitism or Jews, the part that I would add, and tell me if this is correct, is that the early Christian religion canonized the fact that Jews killed Jesus, and
we're going to talk about that.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it did. Yeah, okay, that.
Yes, yes. Yeah. In fact, that's on the slide I'm going to cover. Diana.
Okay, thank you.
Michael, I wanted to mention to you that there are several questions have gone into the chat.
Okay. Thank you. And let me take a quick look at them.
Are you writing?
Yeah. So I'll look at some of the questions. That Israel took over the land that was occupied by the Palestinians. So Jews have been in the Holy Land since the conquest by Joshua, which is confirmed archaeologically, and that's roughly 1100 BCE. There have been since the Jewish nation failed, there have been many people who have controlled the Holy Land. The word Palestine comes from the word Philistines, and it was a derogatory term given to the Holy Land by the Romans. So there were other peoples living there, just as there were Native Americans living in this country before the Europeans arrived. But the Jews have always been there. The Jews are the only people living in Israel that have governed themselves. Every other people living in the Holy Land have been governed by other parties, by the Greeks, by the Romans, by the Persians. Well, I don't know if the Persians govern the Holy Land, by you know, the Ottoman Empire and so on. Okay, so that's that question. Early Christianity, that's Alan's question. Jews are not a race. Race is probably, well, let me just put it this way. However you define race, there are Jews of all races. So definitionally, Jews cannot be a race. I mean, my wife is definitionally an African American. She was born in Africa and she's an American. You can't get more African American than that. She is not, I think, what a biologist would call a Negroid race. She's more Mediterranean, but there are Chinese Jews, there are Black Ethiopian Jews. That one notion, you were saying that the actual notion of one God is behind the hate of Jews, right? That started in Egypt. I would say the idea that not so much one God versus multiple gods, the idea that our God is God and your God is not, incurs hatred. Paganism is inherently tolerant. In pagan times, if you were an Egyptian worshiping Egyptian gods and you went to Canaan, being a good tourist, you would worship Canaanite gods while you were there. And a Canaanite going to Egypt would worship Egyptian gods. It was pretty wide open. Yes, lots of gods. Why not worship a few more? Judaism ultimately develops into a tradition which understands that our God is the only true God, and therefore other gods are false gods. So it's not the number of gods, it's the fact that we're arguing that the God of Abraham is the true God. And by the way, this is the God of half the world, God of Muslims and Christians. Janet, I see your hand up. If you unmute, I guess Janet is not unmuting. Looks like you do. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just put a question under chat.
Okay.
If one opposes the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, but doesn't oppose the existence of Israel, is one anti-Semitic?
No, I would say that
that's
politics. That's politics. You can oppose those settlements. That's perfectly reasonable. If the answer to the settlements is there should be no Jews in the Holy Land at all, that's anti-Semitism. Okay.
Thank you.
So let me move on to Christian anti-Semitism in the New Testament. And I'm just going to highlight a few points and then mention a book. So in the trial of Jesus before Pilate, Jesus basically gives the people, the Jews, the decision whether to murder, whether to execute Jesus or Barabbas. And by the way, in Hebrew, the word Barabbas means son of the father, actually in Aramaic. And the Jews say Jesus. And not only do they say Jesus, but according to the Gospel of Matthew, they answer, his blood be on our heads and the heads of our children. So they are basically, the New Testament is accepting, not only for the Jews in that little community, voting, thumbs up or thumbs down, but taking upon not themselves and our children the responsibility for Jesus' death. In the Gospel of John, John quotes Jesus as saying, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." In Thessalonians are letters attributed to Paul. The Jews who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and persecuted us, they do not please God and are opposed to everyone. Having said this, I want to stress the idea, what's going on in the New Testament is the New Testament is written in the early days of Christianity, when Christianity is relatively powerless, and they're basically appealing to the folks in power, which is Rome. And so if you're trying to get converts among the Romans, you don't want to go in and say explicitly, oh, by the way, you Romans killed God. So the Christians of the time, the authors of the New Testament, had to do what we would call today political spinning. They were stuck with the fact that Jesus was executed by the Romans, that crucifixion was a form of Roman capital punishment and torture, but they didn't want to explicitly blame the Romans, so they had to somehow transfer the blame from the Romans to the Jews, and that's, I think, what we find in the text of the New Testament. And if you're interested in this subject, there's a book. It's fairly old, by Samuel Sandmel, called Anti-Semitism in the New Testament, if you want to, understand that better. So now, moving past the Bible, there is one of the church fathers is Saint John Chrysostom, who is very important, particularly in Orthodox Christianity, and the author of much of Orthodox Christianity liturgy. And if you read his writings, it sounds like it's out of Nazi Germany. I'll just highlight some of them. Synagogues and schools should be set on fire. Their houses should be torn down. They should be forbidden to teach, to praise God, to thank God. The Jews are inveterate murderers, destroyers, men possessed by the devil. God hates the Jews, has always hated the Jews. It is the duty of the Christians to hate the Jews. I just want to emphasize, this is a church father. This is not a Nazi writing. And speaking of respected Christians, Martin Luther is an interesting case study. As you probably know, Luther was protesting what he considered to be Catholic excesses. That's where we get the term Protestant. And so in his early writings in 1523, he's basically arguing that it's Catholic excesses that are responsible for the Jews not converting to Christianity. He says that to be a good Christian, one would have to become a Jew. And he advises and begs everyone to deal kindly with the Jews and to instruct them in the scripture. In such a case, we would expect them to come over to us. Well, he may have expected it, but we didn't. So 20 years later, Luther, who writes a lot in a work called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies, seems to be, I think, almost quoting Chrysostom. Synagogues and churches should be set on fire. We have not willingly tolerated or approved of such public lying, cursing, and blaspheming of his Son and his Christians. Homes should be destroyed. Rabbis forbidden under threat of death from teaching. Cash and valuables should be taken. Expulsion should be applied. God's rage is so great against them that they only become worse and worse through mild mercy, and not much better through severe mercy. Therefore, away with them, and may we be free of this insufferable, devilish burden, the Jews. And I note that the first major Nazi organized anti-Jewish riot, which was conducted by the German government and German authorities, was on Luther's birthday. There are some classic medieval libels which I will just touch upon because I can see time is already, is getting away from me. So ritual murder. Jews were accused of trying to recreate Easter, mainly recreate the murder or the execution of Jesus, leading to trials of 150 trials of Jews and entire Jewish communities. There was an accusation of Jews using Christian blood to make matzah, which is ironic because it is unkosher to even have, medium rare meat. You're not allowed to have any pink. You're not allowed to have any blood. You've probably heard of kosher salt. The idea of salting meat is to remove any blood. The Nazis devoted an issue to ritual murder, and King Faisal of Saudi Arabia continued to tell interviewers that Jews celebrate Passover with Christian blood. Lots of accusations of plots to poison Christians, particularly during the Black Death, where a third of Europe's population, including Jews, died from bubonic plague, and Jews were tortured into confessing to these deaths. And then I find the most bizarre and ironic of all is that shortly after the Fourth Lateran Council of the Catholic Church declared the dogma of transubstantiation, namely that the wafer in communion in Catholic churches is actually the body of Jesus, Jews all of Berlitz's Jews were burned alive for allegedly torturing a wafer. I mean, it's absurd, because if you were Jewish, presumably you wouldn't believe that the wafer was the body of Jesus, but that didn't stop them from murdering all of Berlitz's Jews. In Prague, 3,000 Jews murdered, and so on. Now, I want to acknowledge that Catholic and Christian churches have changed. So in 1994, and I think this was commemorating the 500th anniversary of Luther's writings, the ELCA, the Ecumenical Lutheran Council of America, I could have that wrong, basically said, with pain, we have to acknowledge Luther's anti-Jewish diatribes and reject this violent invective. At this point in time, I was invited by quite a few Lutheran churches and also California Lutheran University, CLU, to come and speak and do a dialogue about Martin Luther and about anti-Semitism. And we see the same thing in other churches, although not all churches. So Cardinal John O'Connor argued, said the church has to address unambiguously the erroneous and unjust application of church teaching on the part of many, which led, at least in part, to a climate which made it easier for the Nazis to carry out the Holocaust. Similar kind of statement by the French Catholic Church. But notice in 1948, now this is right after the war, the German Evangelical Conference said that the terrible Jewish suffering in the Holocaust was a divine visitation and a call to the Jews to cease the rejection and the ongoing crucifixion of Christ. This is why I think it's becoming less and less true in my children's generation than it was in my generation and my parents' generation, but there is serious distrust by Jews of Christianity. So when my Camarillo synagogue moved from an industrial space to share a church with the Church of Christ, a number of people resigned from the synagogue because they didn't want to worship under a cross. And every one of those families that resigned were foreign born. They weren't American born. I think in this country, we have more of an acceptance of the idea of sharing spaces between different religions. And then this is interesting, and I think it is not true today, but in the early days of Israel, it was so bad that in an arithmetic book saying 5 + 9 = 14, they would not even put a cross for the plus sign. That's how Christophobic Jews were. So you see sort of an upside down T as the addition sign. Alan.
You're reminding me that at Adat Elohim, in the period before we built our own building, we borrowed space at the Lutheran church down the street on Hillcrest. And
For high holidays.
For high holidays, I'm sorry, just for that.
Yes.
And there was this sensitivity about having the cross
there. Yep.
Yeah, but the church was more than cooperative to put a blanket or a sheet over it, so it didn't feel like it was.
Yeah, there was not a blanket or sheet over the cross.
It was there.
It was there. I'm certain. I don't
remember. Oh, I thought
I was chairman of religious practices then.
Oh, I knew that committee. I thought I would have known that.
No.
Thank you.
And it was a very stylized cross. It wasn't a crucifix with Jesus actually hanging on the cross.
Okay, well, that reflects the same sensitivity,
yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely.
We did have objections to doing that. Yeah, okay, thanks.
So I want to cover Islamic anti-Semitism. Historically, Jews were better treated by Muslims than by Christians. And similar to the story of Luther, in early years, Muhammad related well to the Jews, expecting Jews to accept the teachings of Muhammad. And when they didn't, he began to condemn them. Jews and Christians were afforded better treatment than pagans in Islam, because in Islam, pagans could be converted at the point of a sword, either convert or die. Jews and Christians, if they were willing to accept Muslim rule and live with special taxes, degrading clothing, yellow badges, as what's called thimnes, would be protected by Islam. It's reminiscent of the way blacks are treated in the South. As a result, most Christian communities under Islam disappeared, with a few important exceptions, the Copts in Egypt and others, whereas Judaism survived and thrived in Muslim lands. Judaism as a religion is not a threat to Islam, but the Jews' refusal to be subordinated is. So my understanding of the theological argument against Jews and Israel goes like this. There is a teaching that land that once becomes under the control of Islam should never leave the control of Islam. And of course, from roughly 700 or so, I would say up until World War I, the Holy Land was under the control of Islam. The Turkish Empire and so on. So I've heard it explained that Jewish existence, a Jewish baby, a Jewish mother, is in effect a Jewish warrior because they refuse to live under the control and power of Muslims. So Jews in Israel are not a threat. Pre-Zionist Jews were not a threat to Islam. But the idea that Jews should control their own nation and their own state is, at least in theory, a threat. And what we see in the Quran are both positive and negative statements about Judaism. So I have them, a few negatives and positive. The Jews, covered with humiliation and poverty and returned in anger from Allah. By the way, Allah is just the Arabic word for Ha'el, the God, because they disbelieved in the signs and so on. On account of their breaking the covenant, you see the W in we capitalized in the Quran. When they say we, it's Allah speaking. Curse them, the children of Israel, made their hearts hard, and so on. And a speech to the Jews, a speech to Muslims, you who believe, Muslims, do not take the Jews and Christians as friends. They are friends of each other, and whoever amongst you takes them for a friend, then surely he is one of them. Surely Allah does not guide the unjust people. But on the other hand, children of Israel, call to mind my favor in which I bestowed upon you and made you excel the nations. And surely those who believe are Jews and Christians and Sabaeans. I don't know who they are. They've disappeared. Whoever believes in Allah on the last day and does good, they shall have their reward from the Lord. There's no fear of them. So like many religious texts, you can pick and choose. And I would say, Muslim theologians absolutely condemn the actions of ISIS and Muslim terrorists. I have to say that, in the last weeks, I've heard quotes from Muslims who are part of interfaith organizations who have been called upon to condemn the actions of Hamas. And they say that if I were to do this publicly, my life and the life of my family would be at risk. I want to go on to Enlightenment and leftist anti-Semitism, just because I think most people don't realize this. Voltaire, who has a pretty good reputation in the Western world, here's a quote from Voltaire. Jews are the most abominable people in the world. They are a totally ignorant nation who for many years have combined contemptible miserliness and the most revolting superstition with a violent hatred of all the nations that have tolerated them. And Marx, who was born of a long line of rabbis and baptized a Lutheran as a child, said, what is the secular cult of the Jew? Haggling, secular God, money. The left, by and large, couldn't tolerate the idea that Jews would not be loyal to the state. Jews would be loyal to the Jewish nation, our own nation. I'm going to spend some time on anti-Semitism, but you're very familiar with, I suspect, anti-Semitism. Nazi anti-Semitism is a unique form of anti-Semitism because it did not offer the opportunity of conversion or assimilation. In almost every other form of anti-Semitism that I've mentioned, in theory at least, if Jews were willing to convert to other religions, other peoples, they would by and large be accepted. Now, not always. This is cultural. You know, there were interesting issues in Spain about sangre pura, pure blood. And as you probably know, there were many Jews in Spain that in order to remain in Spain, said they externally converted to Catholicism, but secretly practiced Judaism. And that's a whole very interesting subject in itself. The Nazis understood Jews as a race, and that needed to be exterminated without without an option for conversion. And the other thing, which I think may surprise you, is the idea that Nazi anti-Semitism was more than just a tool to win support for the war. I hear many people say, well, Hitler used the Jews as a scapegoat in order to drum up popular support. But if you look at what actually happened during the war, so I know this is not terribly large on your screens, but late in the war, when railroad cars and troops were in short supply, not a single car was diverted from death camp duty, nor a single troop diverted from the job of murdering Jews. And Hitler's last words before his own suicide in the bunker in Berlin was, above all, I charge the leaders of the nation and those under them to scrupulous observance of the laws of race and the merciless opposition to the universal poisoner of all people, international Jewry. The Jews under Hitler had no place to go. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of the ship, the St. Louis, who managed to get out of Germany with 800 or 900 Jews and to go to Cuba. And during the time in which they were headed to Cuba, the government in Cuba either changed its mind and did not allow the Jews to embark. There was a great effort to get the Jews the right to embark in the United States, but the United States did not allow the Jews to disembark. This was before the United States entered the war. And so the ship went back to Europe, where 4 nations basically accepted the Jews to disembark, other than Germany. And by and large, it was only the Jews that had the good fortune of winding up in Great Britain that survived the war. And one of the members of my congregation in Camarillo was a woman who, as a child, was on the St. Louis. And also local populations in certain nations, Denmark, Finland, Bulgaria, Morocco, that asserted that Jews were citizens, by and large protected them. You know famously from the movie Casablanca that the Nazis controlled Morocco. And this is, of course, where my wife's family is from. And when the Germans, after they got control over Morocco, told the ruler of Morocco, I think it was a sultan then, not officially a king then, to send his Jews to Germany, to concentration camps, the sultan said, I have no Jews, I only have subjects, and not no Moroccan Jew was sent to Germany. Similar things happen in Denmark and others. And the converse is also true. In Poland, which had the largest Jewish community in the world, in fact, I think it's a very large fraction of American Jews have some Polish ancestry, as I certainly do. And 90%, there were about 3 million Jews in Poland before the war, and 90% of them were murdered. So I think you know, World War II, 55 million people total died, 6 million Jews, including 1 million children, equal to 1/3 of the number of Jews in the world at that time. 70% of Europe's Jews were murdered. 80% of rabbis and full-time students of Judaism was murdered. This had a huge impact on Judaism. I'm a graduate of Hebrew Union College, which was founded in 1875 in Cincinnati. It's the oldest rabbinic seminary in the world. There were many that were much older that were, destroyed by Hitler. Kristallnacht, I mentioned before, where synagogues were burned, homes and businesses vandalized, thousands of Jews beaten, many to death. The Jews were fined for their own damage, for the German damage, and property was given to the Germans, and was held in honor of Martin Luther's birthday. After this, virtually all remaining Jews tried to leave. So sometimes people will say the optimists, the people who were confident about their position in Germany. These were people who were loyal Germans, Jews who were loyal Germans, who fought for the Germans in World War I, often decorated military officers and others, and were very confident, just as I'm confident of being accepted in this country as a loyal American, even though I'm Jewish. Those were the optimists. They basically went to the gas chambers. And the pessimists that kept working on trying to escape, many of them left, but virtually no country would allow the Jews in. And after the Wannsee Conference, which was developed to create the final solution for Jews, when Hitler realized that no nation would accept the Jews, he became very confident that he was on the right track to destroy the Jewish people. And as I say, this is why Jews need Israel, and why I would say I need Israel, because as confident as I am of my position in this country, recent events show me that today it is becoming increasingly easy for people to be vocally anti-Semitic. You can look at Elon Musk. You can look at, I just read today that the Justice Department has opened 7 investigations of colleges in this country of people failing to protect Jews. One of my colleagues in a conference call that I was on says he has a granddaughter at Harvard, and right after October 7th, for a week, she was afraid to leave her dorm room and had non-Jewish friends bringing her food. Early murders, and I'll try and get through this quickly. The early murders were by things called Einsatzgruppen. Jews, and you've seen videos of this, forced to dig their own graves and be shot. Murder squads following German troops into Russia. In Baba Yar, the guns fired nonstop for 3 days. And as a result, the Nazis realized that they were wasting valuable ammunition on murdering Jews. So they developed the idea of gassing Jews, and they would gas them using trucks and put the exhaust in the back of the truck. And then they realized they were wasting valuable petrol that they needed for the war effort. So good German engineers developed using this pesticide called Zyklon and got the cost of murder down to 2/3 of a penny. In Treblinka, of the 870,000 Jews sent, 70 survived. In some camps, decent food was served only on Jewish fast days. The reaction of the church, the Pope and the Catholic Church were silent through most of the war. Despite many requests, there was no condemnation, even when Rome's Jews were sent to the camps. And probably the church was concerned about losing Catholic allegiance because Germany was split between Catholic and Protestants. Nazism was not Christian. Alan, I'm going to hold off on questions for a little bit. Nazism was not Christian, but most Nazis were Christian. Many Protestant churches in Germany supported the Nazis. But Christianity, as I mentioned before, has responded to the Holocaust. But notice that the Vatican only recognized Israel in 1993, and the Vatican that excommunicated Galileo and others has never excommunicated Hitler, who is Catholic. Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, gave out more than 20,000 Swedish passports and is credited in saving up to 100,000 Jews, were arrested by the Russians as a Nazi collaborator, was never heard from again. And there's a very famous quote, which I'm going to come back to at the end of this presentation. Martin Niemöller, I'm probably not saying his name correctly, pastor of a German Protestant church, arrested to the death camps, said, "First they came for the Jews. I was silent. I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists. I was silent. I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I was silent. I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." So many of your Jewish friends interpret silence as indifference and support of anti-Semitic terrorism. some notable responses. An archbishop was asked to intervene with his former secretary, who was a Slovak leader, and his response to stop expulsion of Jews to forced labor camps. His response is, this is no expulsion. There you will not die of hunger and pestilence. There they will slaughter you, young and old, women and children, in one day. This is your punishment for the death of our Redeemer. The papal nuncio, who is the Secretary of State of the Vatican, in 1944, asked to intervene, responded that, neither I nor the Pope can be troubled on a Sunday, since it's a holy day. And the response from the rabbi saying, surely you would do this to protect innocents. And his response was, there is no innocent blood of children, Jewish children, in the world. All Jewish blood is guilty. You have to die. This is the punishment that has been awaiting you because of that sin, namely the death of Jesus. I just want to highlight German engineering and the lack of humanity that goes with it. This was a testimony of a Polish guard from Auschwitz at the Nuremberg trial. And he talks about how women and children were separated for immediate death in the gas chambers because they had no value as slave laborers. The healthy men and young men were kept alive and worked to death. But by and large, 10,000 people were murdered every day at Auschwitz. I actually, when I give this talk in other settings, I show pictures. I actually spent a week in a study session at Auschwitz. So then he goes on to say, the children were then torn from their parents outside the crematorium and sent to the gas chambers separately. At that point, crowding more people into the gas chambers became the most urgent consideration. Separating meant that more children could be packed in separately, or they could be thrown over the heads of adults once the chamber was packed. When the extermination of the Jews was at its height in the gas chambers, orders were issued that the children were to be thrown straight into the crematorium furnaces or into fire pits near the crematorium, without being gassed first. So the Russian prosecutor says, how might I understand this? Did they throw them in the fire alive or kill them first? And the witness said they threw them in alive. Their screams could be heard in the camp. It's difficult to say how many children were destroyed in this way. Question, why did they do this? It's difficult to say. We don't know whether they wanted to economize on gas or whether there was not enough room in the gas chambers. You think about it, a living adult can't be put into a crematorium because they'll struggle and fight, but you can throw babies in if you have zero regard for human life. That's possible and reasonable. Just some comments again about the Holocaust and the state of Israel. The state of Israel doesn't exist because of the Holocaust. There's a lot of discussion among the scholars whether it was the guilt of the world that led to the United Nations forming the partition to form Israel. But probably a stronger truth is the Holocaust couldn't have happened had the state of Israel existed at the time, because it would have been the nation to accept Jews. Israel, and I mentioned this earlier, is a nation of people who are indigenous to the land some 3,000 years ago. There are artifacts, there are coins, there are Dead Sea Scrolls. These are in Hebrew. 3,000 years ago, Jews living in the land speak the same language that Jews living in the land speak today. They continue to practice Judaism. We study the same holy books, and we came to live under the same legal systems as we have for thousands of years. What other nation in the world is denied the right to simply exist in their native land? I'll talk about this briefly and then open the floor for discussion. So the question is, could it happen again? Well, we're seeing it now in Gaza. Judaism teaches that we have free will. I'm actually conducting this study right now in my Monday night classes. Judaism teaches that we have both a desire to do good, called the Yetzer HaTov, and a desire to do evil, the Yetzer Hara. Both inclinations are necessary. One is the Yetzer Tov is like the superego, the altruistic element. The Yetzer Hara is the greedy element, the part of you that, like the id, that wants to acquire stuff. And a fascinating insight into this is something called the Milgram experiment. And I'm just going to cover this very briefly. I'm not going to, there's a 5-minute video which I will skip. People want to see it a little bit later. So here is the Milgram experiment. This was conducted in the early 60s in New Haven, Connecticut. The setup sounds like kind of your typical psychological experiment. You have a guy in a white coat supervising and 2 volunteers. And they draw out of a hat who's going to be the teacher and who's going to be the learner. The learner goes into a different room and is strapped to a chair, and his hand is strapped to an electrical plate where he can receive shocks. And the participant, the teacher, teaches word pairs like fast dog, shining star, I don't know, cold ice, and then prompts the learner with words. And the question is, can the learner correctly repeat back the words? Everybody, I hope, have the basic setup, except it's a sham. The learner is actually not getting a shock at all. The instruction to the teacher is, if the learner misses one, then he gets a shock. The second miss, he gets a higher voltage shock, and so on and so on and so on, up until very high voltage shocks. And as you'll see in a minute, I'll show you the apparatus. The question is, how far would an ordinary New Haven volunteer, under no threat of, being shot or anything, would go to torture his fellow student, or fellow, not necessarily student, but New Haven resident, under the guise of the authority of the guy in the white coat? So again, here's the teacher and the authority, the experimenter, and here's the learner attached to the shock. This is what the instrument looked like. So it started with slight shocks and went to severe danger, 450 volts XXX. So Milgram, the experimenter, thought people would stop, because basically he recorded responses from the learner saying, please stop, I can't take this anymore, I have a heart condition, please stop, I want out, screaming, yelling, and then finally falling into silence. So the guy who's administering the shock asks for the word pair. There's no answer. The person could be unconscious, the person could be dead. And the experimenter said, sorry, you have to go up, 360 volts, 450 volts. So the question is, how far in voltage would ordinary people go? And this is the video, and I'm not going to take time to show it. But basically, everyone went up to about 135 volts. And 60% of people went up to severe and even 450 volt, presumably lethal shock levels. And it was the same for men and women. And this stunned Milgram and actually caused him a lot of trouble, because this was in the early 60s. This is in the aftermath of the Nazis. And, the thing that I think many of us like to reassure ourselves with is the idea that the people that do this, concentration camps, torturers, are animals, are not, are out of their mind, are somehow unique, and we don't have to worry about folks, in this Zoom call doing such things. But what Milgram proved through experimentation is there is this element in all of us. And there was really, in the original setup, 65% of the people went to 450 volts. If instead of a university setting was in an office, that number dropped to 48%. If the person could see the person getting the shock, it dropped to 40%. And if, just to jump to the end here, if the teacher would see other teachers rebel. So some teachers, a small number, said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And some were actually plants saying, I'm not going to do this anymore, while other future teachers were waiting in the room. If they saw other people rebel and stop, only 10% went up to the highest voltage level. Just a word of geography. Israel basically accepted refugees from the entire world in 1948. And, you know, there are Palestinians living in this land and they deserve to live in freedom. I personally am a supporter of Palestinian rights. I think we need a two-state solution. But I observe that there's a lot of room in these other nations if they wanted to allow Palestinians to enter. The West Bank was part of Jordan. Gaza was controlled by Egypt. And once Israel captured them in 67, neither Jordan nor Egypt wanted any part of that land. In 1948, when the Jordanians conquered the Old City, they destroyed every Jewish building in the Jewish quarter of the Old City. And the Jews are not going to willingly give up and leave. So some bottom lines. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I mentioned before, it's okay to be opposed to the actions and policies of the Israeli government, just as it's perfectly okay to be opposed to the actions and policies of the US government. It's not okay, it is anti-Semitism, to be opposed to the existence of the state of Israel as a homeland for Jews. Many of your Jewish friends fear or are actually experiencing a significant outbreak of anti-Semitism. And many of us fear that this could be the beginnings of another Holocaust. Your support of them, now I'm clearly speaking to the non-Jews in my group, is very important. And as was taught to me, and I've mentioned this to some of you with whom I've had private conversations, people have told me, well, I didn't know what to say. And generally speaking, if you don't know what to say, whether it's about this subject or you hear about a horrible disaster in someone's family, you know, terrible thing, a death in the family, a kid commits suicide. You know, I'm a volunteer chaplain for the fire department, and some of my fellow chaplains are on this call. And we go into some horrible situations, and I know that people will say, well, I didn't know what to say, so I didn't call, I didn't say anything. If you don't know what to say, call, send a note, send a text, send an email saying, I just don't know what to say, but I'm thinking about you. And this struck me. I saw this posted, I think, on Facebook, a modern version of Pastor Niermeyer's quote. This one spoken by us Jews. First, they came for the LGBTQ, and I stood up because love is love. And then they came for immigrants, and I stood up because families belong together. Then they came for the Black community, and I stood up because Black lives matter. Then they came for me, but I stood alone because I am a Jew. I hope you all have my email address and my website, and I will be sending out a YouTube link with this presentation. So, you know something? There were 69 people when we started. There are 69 people here at the moment. I'm humbled by your willingness to stick with me. So I'm going to take a quick look at chat and ask if there are any other questions or conversation. You can unmute yourself and cross and statue. Oh, someone asked, is it a custom to cover cross and statues during Lent? I have no idea. Yeah, neither does Alan. Should we be preparing for much worse to come in the way of anti-Semitism? I would say yes. I think things are going to get much worse before they get better, as the reality of what's happening in Gaza becomes more understood, and reporters are in there, and we have the stories of the horror of what's happened to Gazans. And, you know, and of course, there is no question in my mind, if Hamas were to say, look, we know we're going to lose this, we hereby surrender, and we release all the hostages, Israel would stop fighting in 10 minutes. I have no doubt about that. You may think I'm wrong, that Israel is a colonizing power, but I have no doubt about that. but I also don't think it's going to happen quickly. So it's going to get worse, and I would say Jews need to be careful, and Christians and non-Jews, not just Christians, need to speak up, argue politics, no problem, but terrorism, specific targeting of innocents is a war crime, and it's anathema. You know, every rocket going from Gaza into Israel was targeting civilians. Everyone was a war crime. So I'll call on Makawe Barbara, and then Alan.
Thank you. This cannot continue. And every one of us who are in the United States has a senator and a representative in Congress, and we can at least write to them and say, Israel must live.
Yeah, I think the overwhelming majority of senators and representatives are supportive of Israel. It's not unanimous. There are a few that are not, but I don't think that's where the problem is. I think, you know, in the United Nations, I had other slides, but just time prevents me from including them. The United Nations, I think 90% of the resolutions of the General Assembly have been against Israel, as though there are no other problem spots in the world. I'm going to call on others, Alan, before I get back to you. Julie. You need to unmute, Julie. Julie, you need to unmute.
So when you say Jews need to be careful, what do you mean by that?
Well, you know, Jews are nervous about wearing yarmulkes in public, about wearing Jewish clothing in public, and so am I. And you know, for many years, I wore a yarmulke all the time, and I got nothing but to my face but positive results. You know, positive statements about support for Jews, support for Israel. I would not just travel around even my relatively safe community with a yarmulke now. Okay. And, you know, call me a coward and I will plead guilty as charged. And I think we need to keep reminding in public discourse that what happened on October 7th was not okay as a strategy for making peace. I just, you know, one of my colleagues, Christian clergy person, said, you know, we Jews can't tolerate violence in the world. It's not violence in the world. It's abject murder of women, children, babies, innocents. And the image that I thought of kind of on the spot is, imagine you're having a border dispute with your neighbor. Maybe it's his fence. Maybe it's his fruit tree hanging over your tree. Maybe it's his dog getting into your yard. Maybe it's loud music. You know, you're having a serious problem with your neighbor. And he's having a serious problem with you. So one morning on one of your holidays, remember October 7th was the holiday of Sukkot. Your neighbor comes in at dawn, breaks down your door, murders your children. And remember what happened there was there's evidence, there's physical evidence. They tied up 10 and 20 children together with wire and burned them alive. Women were raped to the degree that they had difficulty getting them into caskets because their legs were so dislocated. So imagine that happening in your home, and then a couple of your family members are taken captive next door, and then your house is burned down. And now your neighbor says, okay, let's discuss our border dispute. If this really was about peace, then, and we treat it like that, what we're teaching the world is the way to begin peace talks is to murder, rape, burn children alive, take people hostage. Once you do that, you've forfeited your right to have a reasonable discussion about peace. And by the way, you know, I've heard scholars talk about this, that one of the things that apparently is upsetting Iran and Hamas these days is the fact that Israel was making progress with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states on relations and peace, which was not good for the cause of Iran and Hamas. So you know, again, if I apologize for going off on the politics, but at least I controlled myself to this point. Yeah,
Thank
but
you.
no, but so I would say, in international discourse, we cannot sit still and allow people to say, from the land to the sea, Palestine should be free. We have to call that out. Elon Musk, arguably one of the richest people in the world, is retweeting clearly anti-Semitic tweets. And he's a major contractor to NASA, and people are buying Teslas. And this doesn't seem to outrage. That's kind of where, I mean, I find that astounding. I find that just astounding. We can't pretend that what's going on is normal, and I think that's going to be difficult in the aftermath of the nightmare that's going on in Gaza. It is a nightmare. I'm not minimizing it, but you have Hamas, who's building their facilities under civilian centers, and that in itself are war crimes. So I think we have to be public about opposing that, and not respond to things like this by saying there are fine people on both sides. Alan.
I just wanted to add, Michael, Rabbi Michael, this is very good program. If you want more information on anti-Semitism, an excellent place would be the Anti-Defamation League, ADL.org. They have written materials, webinars, and all kinds of stuff, sometime every week. So I just point to that, especially current topics include challenges in universities also. The second is a really small point. When you said 2/3 of a cent for the gas, the poison, you meant per life is all that
Yes.
needs to kill somebody. You didn't finish the sentence, but I
Oh,
wanted to underscore that.
Yeah, and it's 2/3 of a pfennig, and I have no idea what the exchange rate
It
is.
doesn't matter. That's how they got. It doesn't matter, other than it's per life is the point I want to just.
Yeah, and I would also say that burning babies alive was strictly a matter of economics. I mean, look, actually, not all of you know me. I know this. I'm 75 years old. I've been a rabbi for 20 years. I started rabbinical school at age 50, was ordained at 55. I was a physicist, so I am a great believer in science. The height of scientific knowledge was Germany. And the Nazi experience proves that science is amoral. Science can be used for good, and it can be used for evil. The idea that burning babies alive increases at low or no cost your ability to murder is true. From an economic point of view, from an engineering point of view, it's an accomplishment. But what can you say? What can you say? What can you say? What's the mindset of people going in and committing these kinds of atrocities, of a Hamas terrorist calling his mother and bragging that he just murdered 10 people, and his parents responding that they're proud of him, of filming the murder and torture of people with the victims' cell phones, and then posting those videos on the victim's Facebook page. I mean, this is not politics. This is, it's inhumane hatred. The degree of hatred is just stunning. People are asking, is it safe to visit Israel for a vacation? Israel has a great stake in not letting tourists get into trouble. Israel is empty at the moment. And if I weren't a week away from hip replacement surgery, I would love to be there now. I was actually in Israel before I became a rabbi, working for Israeli companies during the first Gulf War, and it was completely empty. But, you know, now there's rockets raining down. You know, Hamas is out of fuel, but they seem to have fuel for the rockets. So I would certainly think twice. And I know, you know, in Ventura, the local synagogue canceled their Israel trip. Is it safe to put a menorah on display in window for Hanukkah? I feel safe about that. But I have to say, you have to wonder about what neighborhood you live in. You know, was it safe for this guy to display an Israeli flag on a street corner? And he wound up being struck and then falling, hitting his head and dying. So, you know, human life is of supreme importance in Judaism. The idea that we all created in the divine image, and to kill a person is like to kill an entire world. Okay, any other questions, comments? My gosh, we still have 61 people here. So thank you all. I am humbled by your willingness to stay with me. So if there's no more questions and comments, I'm going to do a two-step here. I'm going to stop the recording.